Welcome to another episode of Home Ed Me podcast. So this is episode number 9 and we're going to be discussing history today. So if you're joining in for the first time, this is a podcast every Thursday at 3:30 and we look at different areas of education and learning. So it's open for home editors, for parents, for educators, or anyone that works with kids. So this week we have got the amazing Yvonne. Have I said that right?
Yeah.
It's like the Y and the V always confuses me. I know these are common names and words, and I'm like, I can't say it right. So Yvonne Mason is with us today. She'll be discussing history and how she works with home ed kids, and she's very excited to be here. So we've had to rearrange it a few times because I couldn't make it. But she's very excited to be here today, and I'm really excited to find out a lot more about what she offers. So I saw some of her courses and offerings, and I thought, this is fab. She does for history what I do for science. So I thought it'd be amazing to get her in and to discuss in detail about how she delivers and how she got to where she is right now and her background and her history in teaching. So welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So let's start off with school. What subjects were you interested in? Was history always something that you were keen on?
Where school was concerned, absolutely not. History, yeah, seriously. Yeah. Where school was concerned, history was at best boring, often irrelevant, and at its worst, just a subject I hated. I just couldn't bear it. It was so tedious. And I'm looking back now, I do put that down, unfortunately, to the poor quality of the teaching.
Yeah.
And if any of my friends are watching this, they'll be all going, oh yes, we know who you're talking about. So yeah, history, I mean, particularly secondary, when it got to things like GCSE, was literally just, it was modern history, which I'm not as passionate about as I am about medieval history, which is my big passion. I teach modern history now among other periods, and I enjoy teaching it, and I have some great times with my students. But you know, everybody has that period that they are particularly fond of, and my passion is medieval history. But I think modern history can be made fascinating, and any period in history can be made fascinating, depending on how it's delivered and how the tutor delivers it and the passion of the person delivering it. And my secondary school teacher had absolute zero of that. She was clearly very bored and couldn't wait to retire, which she wasn't far off. And I didn't get on with her. So for me, history was a nightmare. In terms of early starting with history myself, I was fascinated with ancient history and Egyptology. And get me at home, and I would pour through all 21 editions of my children's Britannica, you know, the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is now online, but I had it in book form when I was a kid. And I would just read ancient Greek, ancient Egyptian history and mythology. My mum bought me beautiful big coffee table books. I had an RE teacher at school when I was in sixth form who spotted my passion for that subject and was kind enough to take me to Manchester to have a look around the museum and then to go to a special book launch with an Egyptologist and things. So as far as I was concerned, I wanted to study Egyptology at college. That's what I was going to do. That was my thing.
You talk about the passion at home. Where did that stem from? Was it from primary age, or was it actually when you were at secondary age school?
No, it was from when I was quite young. And I think it was nurtured by my mum, because my mum did a really good job of, well, I think she'd have been a good home editor, actually, although that kind of thing didn't exist for us. But she did a really good job of placing a series of learning experiences in front of me. She taught me to read before I went to school. She got me watching the RSC's complete season of Shakespeare plays and bought me a complete works of Shakespeare in order to follow them. You know, she kind of took me to castles and, you know, all sorts of historical sites. She would take us and we'd go to museums and all sorts of things. So that, I think, and history is a big thing in our family, going back generations anyway. There's a lot of interest in genealogy. My mum was an avid family history researcher, and my daughter, who's a home educated student, or has just finished being, is now running her own genealogy business, having been got into it by her grandma. So she's like 17, and she's now 2 years into her running her own research business, which she's doing really well, which I'm very proud of her. Yeah, so I think it's something that was kind of there in the family. My mum always loved history. She always had history books. But I think there was one seminal moment that I can still remember even now. I was 11. My mum bought a book about the monarchy of England. I can't remember the name of the book. And it started with William the Conqueror. And I remember opening this book and reading first. It was a grown-up book. It wasn't a kid's book. It was just something she bought. And I remember reading that first page, and it said, somewhere back in the midst of time, a child of the devil married one of the House of Anjou. And that phrase, the mists of time, just went in my head, and something just caught there. And I became fascinated with the connection in the present and the past. And for me, you know, the way that came out for at least a good 8-9 years was through the Egyptian side of things, the Egyptology and the mythology and all that kind of stuff. But medieval history was to come later. And again, it was a single person and a single moment that triggered that off as well. But in school, yeah, history was a bit of a dead end, really. And I failed my history GCSE the first time round. I got an E. I resat it, got a C. So I just about scraped that one. I chose to do history, English and religious studies for sixth form.
They allowed you to do it with a C.
Oh yeah, they did. They allowed me to begin the history course on condition that I resat and passed the GCSE.
Oh wow.
So I resat and passed the GCSE. All sorts of personal circumstances were why my GCSEs didn't go well the first time round. I have a little kind of blog thing that I put on my website, on my Facebook page sometimes, which is about my journey, because the early years were dogged by problems and failure, and were turned around. So, you know, it's a story I think a lot of people have found quite helpful. But personal circumstances meant that my GCSEs were very difficult, and I failed most of them. But I had an inspirational English teacher who was fantastic, and I now, because my other subject is English, I teach both subjects. And she is my hero, my guru. You know, she's no longer with us, sadly, but she is still my guru for teaching English. But yeah, so I just revised it and I resat it and I got a C, and that was fine. But again, unfortunately, the teaching for A-level, different teacher this time, but still someone who really was not very good at teaching, unfortunately. And I found at that point the content was too heavy for me. And again, and I started to have some illness, and my doctor kind of said, you need to drop the history because it's stressing you out and you can't do it. And so quite sadly, I complied with that. And so that kissed goodbye to me doing history at college. And the other thing to do was English, because that was the only other thing I was good at. And of course, there is a link between English and history. They are cousins of each other. So, you know, at least I could find a way. And when I did eventually go to do English for my first degree, and we got to the third year, I was able to choose and design my final year. And I just ditched all the modern stuff. And my final year of my degree was all Chaucer, and it was medieval verse, and it was Shakespeare. And, you know, I stuffed as much history into that as I could.
And it's interesting how you mentioned the fact that the teachers played such a fundamental role in how you viewed the subject and how well you did. Because even I look back at my secondary age teaching and French, I didn't like it because the teacher didn't like me. And every time I was in the room, I felt that tension and I felt that friction, because she'd point at me and she'd go, oh, did you get 2 out of 20 again in that test? And I hated being in that room. So whenever she was there, I'd be failing. I'd be getting E's, but I dropped it at the end of year 9, so I didn't carry it on for GCSE. But there was a period of time, and I've mentioned this before on the shows, that there was a period of time where she was away because her father had died and she'd taken 3 or 4 months off. And during that period of time, we had a supply teacher. And again, French teacher, but she had no kind of perceived judgment of anyone in the class. So she came in with a blank kind of slate. We all had blank slates by that point. And then I worked so hard in those 4 months, I was getting A stars at the end. And then returns my normal French teacher, and I'm back down to a D and an E. And just that change, because she didn't like me and she didn't see me doing well, and that expectation and the way that you're made to feel has such a big fundamental impact on a student. So you need a teacher that believes in you, but you also need someone whose style relates, so you can resonate with, and it works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was the difference between my history teacher and my English teacher. I was fortunate to have Miss Neal from when I was 13 right up to finishing A levels, and she loved her subject, she loved teaching, and she loved her students. And she put a lot into every class, you know, she loved it. Even the grammar stuff, you know, I remember spelling tests. She was wise enough to keep us doing spelling tests right up to GCSE, so we all came out with really good spelling. But, you know, her eyes would light up when she was explaining Hamlet. I remember studying Hamlet. I've never forgotten it. I've never forgotten the course we did on Hamlet. I've never forgotten the poetry. It was there. My mum bought anthologies of poetry, and I read them and read them and read them. And Miss Neal also taught us how to understand and read and appreciate poetry. And that's something I've carried with me. It's one of my favorite things to teach in English. I love poetry. So absolutely, the difference between a poor history teacher and an excellent English teacher. And believe it or not, I had a very similar story where French was concerned. I had a dreadful French teacher, failed the GCSE, thought I was rubbish at it. But many years later, when I needed to have a European language, when I was working at the Tower of London, I got a friend of mine who was a French speaker to teach me, and then I studied it, and I was using it every day with the French visitors. So
I think the most unfortunate thing is that when you get into the frame of mind of I failed that, I can never be good at it, and it's so easy to do that, where you've had years of teaching and you're not getting what you should be, or you're not getting the average, or you're not getting the expected, to then kind of go, right, that's not for me. And I think a lot of kids and even adults, the parents of the kids will say, oh, I'm not good at maths, oh, I'm not good at English, and they won't even make an attempt to make any changes. But as an adult, as someone that's matured and you've learned stuff over the years, you come back to it, it's completely different.
Absolutely.
It's the same story with art. I loved art. It was my passion. I wanted to pursue it. I wanted to do art for the rest of my life. And then there was certain things that I didn't get along with my art teacher. She wanted me, I always did floral stuff, bright, colourful, positive looking images. She wanted me to go dark and death, and I was like, I don't want to do it. What's my mum going to do with a painting of a tombstone on the wall? It's like, we're not
absolutely
use of that. And because I didn't do what she told me to do, she basically failed me, and I couldn't pursue it. I couldn't pursue it for my second year of A level. Well, she didn't fail me, but she gave me a C, which in the school I was at, you needed a B to pursue to an A level, and they weren't even going to allow me to even reconsider. But it's just that kind of, you get hit by a wall sometimes, and you kind of give up. But many years later, I've come back to the art on my own terms now. So it's just about finding your way back to it. But the sooner you realize, the better it is, because you'll realize that's where your passion is, and you've come back to French again, and you've come back to history. And it takes a lot for someone that didn't do well initially to then come back again, to have those failures. But failure is the first attempt in learning.
It is. I think failure, and I say this to my students also, is failure is very painful. Let's face it. We all would rather not fail. We're all afraid of failure in some ways, you know, and as tutors, you know, we have our own angst about things. But failure is a painful teacher, but it's a very valuable teacher, because if we are wise about it, we can turn our face towards the failure and go, okay, what was that about? What do I need to change in order to turn it round? And not to be afraid to give it another shot. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of our jobs as teachers and tutors, is giving students who have failed in that sense, that they haven't got those grades that they wanted or expected of them, or perhaps just had their confidence knocked by other teachers maybe. I'm trying to be sensitive about this, but it's happened so often. I know I've had to repair a lot of damage in my time, and I think just to give students the confidence to kind of go, okay, let's just give it another shot and see them succeed, and go, my gosh, I can do it.
I think the problem is that we forget that teachers are just humans, and you're going to get, and just like any kind of human, you're going to get some that you get along with, you're going to get some that you don't get along with, you're going to get somewhere you kind of share the same values and that you're on the same wavelength, and you're going to get others where you just don't. And you're going to get some people that like you and some people that don't. And just because you're a teacher, it doesn't make you a superhuman or make you any different from any other human.
That's right,
you still have those emotions. So yeah, there are going to be some teachers which aren't that great, and there are going to be people that you're not going to get along with. And then there's other people that come in your life that end up repairing that. And I guess as tutors, we see that from a teaching and education perspective, but it happens in all walks of life.
Yes, it does.
So it's just realizing that actually it's not necessarily because they're teachers, it's because they're human.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It is right. You know, I mean, looking back now as an adult, I look at my history teacher at school and I think, you know, she was pretty awful. But if I look at it more closely, I can see that she probably had been teaching the same curriculum year in, year out, year in, year out. I don't think, looking at it now, I don't think that modern history was her thing either. I think she was clearly bored by it. And I think she didn't really understand it either, because I've had these weird deja vu moments when I've been sitting teaching GCSE modern history, and I've been teaching my students about a certain aspect of what happened in, say, 1939 or whatever, or the rise to Nazi Germany or whatever. And then I've kind of gone, oh my goodness, I'm teaching exactly the same lesson as I remember being bored by, and just thinking, there were some times where she would be explaining something. She would dictate for 50 minutes for an hour. You just literally sit and write dictated notes for 50 minutes, and then interspersed with about 10 minutes in total of explanation. And there were things I remember her saying that I thought to myself at the time, she doesn't really understand this. And I think she was also very close to retirement age. So yeah, she was human. She was probably in the wrong place. She was a doctor of history, and she went on to become an education advisor. Who knows, maybe she was miles happier doing that than, you know, going through the same thing year in, year out.
And I think that's what's really important, to find something that you're very passionate about and to pursue that, not to pursue what your parents are telling you, not to pursue what your friends are telling you to do, pursue what you want to do.
Yes.
The last thing that you want is to be in a role like that, where you become that history teacher, you're doing something that you don't enjoy doing and you don't really want to be there. And you hate it so much that you just let out that kind of, you project that kind of negativity onto your students, because that's what happens. And I guess the French teacher was in the same boat. She didn't really enjoy teaching, because if you did, you wouldn't be treating your students like that. So I think it's just that, it's just realizing that actually it's not you, it's the environment that you're in and the people and their experiences and their background and all the baggage that they're bringing along with it. And you can't really separate the two all the time.
That's true, absolutely. But fortunately, you know, that what happened with my history experiences didn't take long before, as you say, it was repaired. I only came out with 2 A levels in the end, and that meant I couldn't go to university as such, because back then it was the late 80s, you know, you had to have 3 A levels to even be considered. And I'd wanted, for some reason, I kind of had it in my head that I was going to do drama instead, because I loved drama, but didn't realise I was really not cut out to be an actress. So I applied to 9 universities or 9 colleges or whatever for drama, and got rejected right across the board on the strength of just my application form. So when I finished my A-level year, came out with my A-level grades, I had no place to go to. So I was basically stuck at home working in a hotel, because I came from a tourist resort in North Wales, and had no idea what I was going to do, really. The next year I applied to 5 more, 4 for drama, 1 as an afterthought. I spoke to my English teacher and said, do you think I could cope with doing an English degree? And she said, totally, absolutely, you could do that. Oh, okay then. So as an afterthought, I stuck in another application form for what was Birmingham Polytechnic at the time.
Yeah. And
I don't know, it's got some posh name now because it's a university now. But I got accepted with an unconditional offer immediately. And so that was, okay, that's where I'm going. Yeah, that's right. So, I've often thought to myself since, why didn't I just apply for English from the word go? I could have got so many more offers, maybe. Yeah. Who knows? But anyway.
You've got to go through that process to actually to go on to the path that you're meant to. Because if you'd got all those offers, you would have ended up in a university that would have completely changed your direction in life. But but it was that specific uni that accepted you, and they did it with unconditionally as well.
Yeah, I mean, my time there was not a happy one. It was another difficult one, and it ended in me having glandular fever in the first term of my final year. So I lost I lost the entire first term of my final year. The second term I was still very ill, but kind of managed to scrape through, and I sat my exams mostly by borrowing other people's revision notes and things like that. And the college were very good and dropped one of my courses, so they kind of let me get my honours degree on the basis of only 7 courses instead of 8. So they really helped me with that. So I came out with my degree, but it was a long slog. But I found myself on what apparently at the time was the fourth best English course in the whole of the UK.
Wow.
And it was a superb course, and we did have some inspirational lecturers. And I think, right from the very beginning, I remember we did a course in the first year. It was one of the first things we ever did on medieval verse literature from 1300 to 1500. And one of the first things we had to do, the very first assignment, was translating a whole big wodge of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a wonderful Arthurian verse epic tale. And we were being trained in how to translate what we call Middle English, which is the version of English from about 1300 to 1500. And I spent 3 days translating it, absolutely loved it. And then we had to write an analysis on it. And I got a first for it straight away for that particular essay. I did really well on it. And then the same teacher, I remember he and his colleague were teaching us Chaucer. So they introduced us to the Canterbury Tales, which I'd not done much of. We'd done a little bit with my English teacher back in school, but we really were going into it in detail. And they were talking to us about estate satire, because Chaucer wrote a genre of literature called estate satire. In other words, he's poking fun at the society of the time. To understand that, you've got to understand the society of the time. So they started telling us about the society of the time, and I'll never forget him. Philip Smallwood, his name is. I think he's retired now. And he just lit up, his whole face lit up when he talked about Chaucer, and he talked about the 14th century, and he talked about England and the society of the time. And that was another one of those big moments, because something just went, and it put a light bulb on in my head. And at that point, I fell in love with medieval history, and was able to spend a lot of time at college just immersing myself in medieval history and Shakespeare's time, etc., because the way that they taught the courses was, we studied a text from every century from the 8th to the 20th. And of course we started with Beowulf, and we started with all these wonderful medieval and right up to the 16th century texts, and we went beyond that, but they always placed them within their historical context. So for me, it was a journey into medieval and Tudor history while I was learning the literature that went with it. which is one of the great things that we have at Dreaming Aspires Home Learning when I teach with Kat, because Kat does Renaissance literature and medieval literature. She does all those great texts from the 14th, 15th centuries, and I teach the history side of it. So we kind of complement each other, you know, and that's what was going on at college. The English and the history were complementing each other. And that was wonderful for me.
I think a lot of that's missing from the education system, where they're taught as very distinct subjects.
Yeah.
There's never really that link made across the subjects, when clearly you could, like maths and science, you can make a clear link, but they never taught like that. Or you could make a link with everything, with history, with English, with science. But again, they don't make that link. They're taught as very separate subjects. And I think there's a big, what's the word? They're missing out on something really amazing to be able to draw in and create a cross-disciplinary approach to learning, which I think some unis are able to do, because you're going at a greater depth into that subject, so you can draw in other aspects of it. So for example, when I did my physics degree, I did a lot of maths in there, in the physics, and in maths, because I was in both departments, when we were taught maths, they drew in a lot of physics questions in. So it was really great to see that. And even though my final year project was actually in the maths department, it was very much applied physics, and what we were doing was physics, but it was run in the maths department. So there was that kind of merging of two different subjects together, which was really nice. And we're missing that from the education system.
I think less so at primary. I think they have a lot more leeway to actually do a combined discipline. You know, they kind of spread it. I've seen schools do this across the board, where they'll have a week or so where they'll be concentrating on, say, Tudor history, and they'll find all sorts of different ways of weaving the different classes and different subjects into that same theme. And I think it's done really well.
You still have the same issue where the teacher might not be passionate about it.
Yeah, true.
So at secondary, you're more likely to get someone that's passionate about their subject because they picked to do that subject. So technically, they should be more passionate. But at primary, you're kind of forced to teach everything across the spectrum. So there might be some areas where like, oh, I don't want to be doing that, but you're made to do it. So it comes back to, well, actually, if you don't have a teacher that's passionate, then it's not really a great idea to do it as a cross discipline, because you're going to be put off by everything.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
But I know that a lot of schools do it, and it's great when they do have a specialist in primary that is a kind of train the other teachers, or even go in and do that part of it. I think that would work really well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I've had one or two opportunities to actually do that. And there was a primary school not far away where I went and did an inset session for teachers on the Tudor period in preparation for a week, and then they got me in I think I wore my medieval kit. I think I got me in costume, and I did a whole kind of day with all the different classes on medieval food dining. Yeah, it was great. And we had them set the school hall out for a medieval feast, and we had the kids all had been picked so that, you know, there was the lord and the lady, and we had some of the kids, I was teaching them how to be servants and how to move and bow and how to provide the food and stuff, and so we're just helping them all to understand how to do it. And then we were kind of doing dancing, and I did some preparatory lessons on food and things like that. But that was kind of my bit. But the teachers had all kind of jumped in, and they'd got a whole bunch of other lessons throughout the week, all kind of done in with mixed in with the whole thing. So it became a whole school thing, and I think they all enjoyed it, actually. You know, they all enjoyed getting in there.
Because you're someone from the outside coming in, kids get excited by that anyway, but being like incredibly passionate about what you're doing, and that's going to create a memorable moment for them for the rest of their lives. They'll remember, oh, do you remember when we did Tudors and that woman came in and she did all this stuff with us and we had a feast? They'll remember that for ages. And I think that's what it's about. It's about creating those memorable moments, and then the knowledge stays because it's attached to a very strong memory that they've got.
Particularly a positive one.
Yeah, exactly. So what happened after uni? So I think we spoke about you merging the two subjects together, and you're kind of specializing in the history side a bit more. You would have loved Latin.
Yes, and that's actually a journey I'm currently on. I guess I'll comment on that if you like in answering your question, because Latin does feature later on. Basically what happened, because I was very involved in kind of Christian things and the church and things like that, I went home. It took me about 2 years to recover from the glandular fever and just a really difficult time at college. And I wanted to go and work for a church as a musical director. That was my thing. I really wanted to do. And I was very fortunate to be offered a job doing that in London about 2 years later. And so I moved to London. I'd already met my future husband at that point, and he happened to be at the same church. And I lived with his vicar and his wife and the family for 2 years, and I kind of helped to run the music and do some of the youth work at the church as well. Wasn't very good as a youth worker. I'm much better as a tutor than I was as a youth worker. Maybe it's because I'm older, I don't know. But yeah, so I had a great time doing all that, because I'm a singer and a musician and did all that kind of thing, and that was fine. And then that all kind of came to an end, and because I just basically was ready to stop at that point. I had no intention whatsoever of teaching, which is why I hadn't actually done a teaching qualification. I hadn't stayed on and did a PGCE. It wasn't even remotely on my radar. No intention of doing that at all. But found, you know, because of 2 years of working with young people of different ages, particularly the younger teenage years, Key Stage 3, that for some reason I found I could teach. I could communicate to young people in a way that they would get it and enjoy it. And that was like, oh, okay, where's that come from? But then two things happened. First of all, I wrote to the Dean of Westminster Abbey and said, can I come and be a guide at Westminster Abbey? Because it was one of my favourite places on the planet. And the Dean wrote back and said, sure. So I spent a year being a guide at Westminster Abbey, which was really good fun. And I was part of a team of volunteers. There was me, who was about 23, and the next youngest was about 65. And all the elderly folks who were lovely, brains like planets, just knew so much about history, about the Abbey itself, taught me a lot. Thought I was very strange, because why was such a young person wanting to do that job? And I mean, for someone who was now in love with medieval history, it is just one of the best things you can do. You just go and put yourself in the middle of this amazing 1,000-year-old building. And I stationed myself in front of the coronation chair and the Stone of Scone and the Shrine of St. Edward and all the medieval kings around me, and started researching Edward I and just immersing myself in history. The second thing that happened was in late 1996, early 1997, I went to the Tower of London on a visit, and my life changed. Because I'd been walking around the tower for 3 hours. I was on my way out. I had one of those moments where you just feel that voice telling you, you have to go in here. And I was passing Traitor's Gate and the building over Traitor's Gate, and I just had this really strong prompting, I should go into that building. So I did, and it turned out there was a replica of the coronation chair, which I was researching, so I went looking for it. Got talking to a guy in full 13th century dress. And we're not talking Disney stuff here. We're talking, you know, he had a real sword and all the rest of it. And so we got talking, and I told him that I was a guide at Westminster Abbey, told him about my research, and he started asking me questions, and he got me talking. And he pulled a ring off his finger and he said, what do you think of that? That is 14th century. And I went, whoa, you know, like, who was the person who wore that ring? You know, it's like we can connect with that person. And then he said, I'm the managing director of this historical interpretation company, and I think you'd be great at this job. Would you like an interview? And it was like, oh, okay. So I said, yeah, sure.
That's the best way to meet an employer.
Isn't it just?
You're aware, and you're just completely yourself. You're not nervous. You're just having a normal conversation, and then something just comes out of it.
That's right. And that was amazing. He'd already decided to hire me, and a month or so later I was there on duty, realizing that my colleagues also had brains the size of planets where medieval history was concerned. And I just thought, oh my goodness, I better go back to college and get some decent training in medieval history. And again, it was the same kind of thing that happened to get my MA course. I wrote to 5 universities, one of them Royal Holloway at Egham, professor wrote back, and she said, we don't have a prospectus, come down to the university, have a cuppa, I'll tell you about the course. And I sat there with her for an hour, and she said, well, I don't think you need an interview, I'll just tell them to give you a place. So I kind of walked into my MA place, and I spent 2 very happy years working at the Tower of London for half the week and being in university immersed in the world of medieval history for the other half of the week. And it was 2 of the happiest years of my life. And that's, again, working at the Tower, I had to take school classes who would come in Tudor costume, and kind of be working with those. So I learned to present lessons. I was trained in public speaking. I was trained to talk to audiences of many different sizes, spontaneously with the information in my head, because we couldn't use books, we had to have it all up there. So I was trained through the Tower and my university course as a researcher, and learned huge amounts of different skills. Had to start learning French in order to communicate with all the French speakers that came across. My MA was medieval studies, so that included Latin, which was wonderful because I'd never had the chance to learn that before, and I'm kind of slowly relearning it because that was a while ago now, but because the aim is to go and do a PhD in medieval history at some point in the next few years. So again, yeah, that was an incredibly positive time, and I really felt that laid a lot of ghosts to rest, I think, academically. But I came out, again, not intending to teach. I didn't deliberately try.
You delivered sessions for classes.
Yeah. I never wanted to teach in a school. Never wanted to teach in a school. I've done the occasional guest day, as I've said, but the idea of being a day in, day out classroom teacher just did not appeal to me. I wanted to be more creative in what I did. But then my husband and I, for various reasons, were moving to Wales, and the project we were supposed to be part of, it was a church project, fell through for about 6 months, and I'd already left the Tower, had my kind of leaving do and all the rest of it. So suddenly I had a hiatus, and it was like, what do I do now? Need to earn some money. What can I do? Well, I can teach. Let's join a tutoring agency, and I'll teach English and history. And so I had 3 girls from Northwood who had their whole class had failed a module on A-level Richard II.
I had nothing to do with the teacher, right?
Oh no, none whatsoever. So that was a Shakespeare play, which I hadn't studied, but I kind of knew about, and I knew a lot about Richard II himself, and I knew a lot about Shakespeare. So I worked with them for a term, and that was the first time I think I saw a group of students who really couldn't bear Shakespeare finished the term loving him. And that, for me, they all raised their grades, they all got their grades, but they wrote to me at the end and they said, the most important thing you've given us is a love for Shakespeare. And that, for me, was far more important. It was like,
and yes! I guess that was your part, that was your moment where it was another light bulb moment where you the satisfaction of getting those kids learning and loving something that you are passionate about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so basically that kind of taught me that, that was something I could do. We then moved, and I immediately fell pregnant with my daughter. So I took 3 or 4 years off. We were doing other things at that time, working with churches and doing various stuff. But I took 4 years off tutoring. And really, when my daughter was 4, that's when I really started to think about, well, let's get a few hours a week, let's just start tutoring. And it was school kids. Home ed was not on our radar at that point, nor was working with home educators, because we didn't know any. Although it was something we felt that we wanted to do for our daughter, but at that time my husband was becoming ill with a long-term illness, and I needed a break. And so our daughter went into school for 3 years, and then she came out at the age of 7, and she's been home educated for the rest of the time. She's just finished her exams, so we've just finishing that journey, and loved it. It was a great thing to do. But I was very fortunate again to meet a particular family who again were life-changing for me. They were a local family. I joined a tuition agency to get some students, and straight away this local family found me through the agency, and they had 9 children, and they needed somebody to teach history to one of the middle girls to take her through English.
That was you sorted for a few years, right?
Well, yeah, more or less. Yeah, they wanted me to teach English GCSE, to coach in English her for English GCSE on her own. So we did 2 or 3 months, and then they came to me and said, well, the lady who's been teaching the other 4 English and history is now moving out of the area. Would you take over? And that's 8 hours a week, which for me was fine. So I just said, yeah, sure. And I found myself spending 8 hours a week with young people aged from 6 to 16. So all of a sudden I had to learn to teach across all 4 key stages at once.
Were they home educated?
Yeah, they were, yeah. They were a home educating family. Yeah. So I was not just
came across.
Yeah, and I was instantly a teacher. Yeah. You know, I wasn't just coaching. I was now having to do lesson plans and build schemes of work and teach a 6-year-old how to read, which was a total joy, while getting the others through Key Stage 3 and GCSEs and various things. And they taught me so much about home education, about how to work with home educators, how to understand the mindset, how to cope when you meet your first home ed kid and they look you straight in the eye, you know, that scary moment. It's like, oh my God.
I have a conversation with you which
yeah.
from a lecturer, and you're like, how old are you again?
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, they are just the best. And they were, and we are still huge friends, and all of them are grown up now, and you know, they stay in touch, and they were amazing, and they trained me. So when it came to that point where my daughter was coming out of school and we were starting home ed, we had some idea of what we were doing because I'd been doing it for 3 years, you know, so that was amazing. But at the same time, you know, I continued to have other school kids as well come in for help with literacy and for exams and all sorts of things, which was a joy, you know, lovely kids from around the area. Really, and that's how that started. That's that kind of just a few hours a week with learning to teach and learning to tutor is where I began.
How did you manage that once you started home educating yourself?
Well, I was very fortunate, in actual fact, in that our family was kind of set up for it, because my husband was a peripatetic music teacher. He was a professional saxophone and clarinet player, and so he worked from home. He went out to schools on some days, but he also worked from home. So right from the word go, we planned a timetable, because our particular way of approaching home education was structured with set lessons and things like that, set times to do things, although it was flexible as well. It wasn't carved in stone. So we had to do that because we knew we needed to build around our daughter's education, but also my husband had lessons, I had lessons. So we just planned a timetable every academic year where we both could work. And when one of us wasn't teaching our daughter, we would be working, and then we'd swap over, and we divided the subjects between us. So I did the arts and humanities, my husband did the PE and the practical making things and woodwork and maths and science and all that kind of stuff, and music, obviously. So we kind of worked it out between us, and we shared the load right through, really. Sometimes we got in other people to help, and Ellie went to an online school as well for a while and did very well there.
I think that's a nice way of doing it, because a lot of the times, a lot of the families that I work with, it's the mums that take the lead, and the dads are out working and the mums are taking the lead at home, and a lot of the times the dads don't know what they're learning or how they're learning, but they still want to have a say in the education, and that they're worried and all this, but they don't really know what's going on day to day. So I think it's nice that you had that balance, so then both of you could be part of that learning process.
Yes.
For your daughter to have 2 different teachers who are consistently teaching her, where she could ask one, and the learning styles would have been different. Your teaching styles would have been different as well, so that would have been nice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it worked for us. Towards the end, you know, she said when she hit year 7, she said, I'd really like to learn in more groups. She had been taking part in small classes with me because I had some small live groups at home where 2 or 3 of her friends or other students would come, you know, and have small classes, which is where I learned to teach on a long-term basis, kind of key stage 3 stuff and what have you. So she had that, but she wanted to have a wider range of being able to interact with people. So she became a student at Interhigh online high school. And that was because I'd been hired by them. They came and kind of found me on a tutoring directory and asked me to go teach A-level history for them. And that was, again, another part of my training, really, because all of a sudden I was solely responsible for the A-level history course for Interhigh. And that's where I began my real journey into online teaching. I've been teaching, you know, individuals on Skype, and that was fine. But this was, again, preparing a whole exam-based scheme of work, dealing with students, dealing with an online learning platform, a whole homework system, all this kind of stuff. I had to do the entire course at a time. And that was great because they were very supportive and I learned a huge amount. And then about 3 years in, I think I was ready for another adventure and had other things happening that I wanted to develop. So I kind of said goodbye to Interhigh. And at the same time, I was hired again. It was another same thing, Wolsey Hall, Oxford, which is a home education distance learning college. It's very well known. They came looking and they found me on the same directory and hired me as an English and history tutor. And I'm still working with them. So I've been with them 4 years. And again, they've taught me a whole load of other stuff, you know, and one of the things that they got me doing was rewriting a 2-year KS3 history course into a 3-year one, kind of adapting things. So, you know, each avenue, each happening has given me a different set of skills and built my confidence so that I could actually go, okay, I'm doing this for these people, can't I do it for myself? And I thought, right, okay, let's see what I can do about launching my own online classes. And what about running my own GCSE courses online for students? You know, what if I try that kind of thing? And that's been a steady journey where I've been developing the classes and they've been running now. I teach all 3 years of KS3 for English separately. And then I have 2 classes for a mixed age for history for KS3. I've just finished 2 or 3 years of teaching GCSE history in classes, and I've run IGCSE English language, literature, and I've had a break this year from all of that, but I'm starting again with another IGCSE course in September, an online class, and just expanding, just seeing what else I can do, how I can expand what I do. And then again,
busy. You sound really, really busy. You're like lots of different things.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing to bring in is that Kat Patrick, for whom I have a huge amount of respect and admiration, who is, I think, one of the most knowledgeable and inspiring home education tutors and teachers there is, with Dreaming Spires Home Learning. She came looking for me and nagged me for 2 years to go and teach history for Dreaming Spires, which again has been totally different because the last 2 years I've taught intensive courses, one on the First and Second World Wars. So we did a whole year on just the First and Second World Wars and the interwar period. And last year, to my great joy, I was able to put together a 30-week course on the Middle Ages. So I just got to share with my students all the stuff I love about medieval history, and just expose them to the authentic voices of the time, not just textbooks. We work with what we call living books written by people with a passion. These are non-exam courses. I've got them designing their own castles, cooking medieval food, debating, doing all sorts of things. I had them 1 week, 2 weeks we spent where I divided the class up into attackers and defenders, and we staged the siege of Stirling Castle. And so they had to do a whole bunch of research to find out how weapons and siege warfare worked. And then I had them answering different questions and going off and making decisions and responding to each other and working out how to besiege Stirling Castle while giving them the real story at the same time.
And this is all online?
This is all online. Yeah, this is all online.
Because you've got such a big reach as well. And also the fact that you've mentioned it's non-examinable means that you can just go crazy with it and just really deep into certain areas and not have to worry about catching up with the curriculum. If the kid's really inspired by a particular topic, you can just spend weeks on it and not have to worry that you're going to have to, you don't have to, you've run out of time. So it's great that you're able to do that. And I think that's what I've been able to do with the science, where a lot of the science I teach, I form the courses, we don't test them, it's not non-examinable. It'll help them with Key Stage 3 and GCSE, because I'm not doing it for a particular exam. I can go crazy. We can go and find out research about certain areas, current research, put that in, find out about careers, put that in, and it makes it that much more exciting to teach as well.
It does, yeah, absolutely. And sometimes very moving as well. I must say, teaching in that way, able to really to go in depth, giving the students, they have to do about 3 hours of independent reading, documentary watching, because I always put documentaries in because, you know, you need to see history as well. And sometimes activity tasks. For the Modern World History course, which I'm not running this year, but I did run it last year, it was running over Armistice Day, Remembrance Day. And so what I asked the students to do was to go and research a soldier, either from their own community or their local area or their country, research that soldier, find out where he served, how he served, what regiment he was in. It had to be someone who'd lost their life. And so how he came to lose his life, where he's remembered, and then to do something active to remember him on Remembrance Day. And we have like a forum, a discussion forum. They have 3 discussion questions they have to answer. So that was one of the discussion questions I gave them. And I said, upload a picture or video, whatever you did. And several of them, particularly in the first year, did the most beautiful posters with information and picture, if they could find it, of the soldier, and then to have people photograph them or video them going and laying them on the local war memorial to remember that soldier. And I found that incredibly moving.
That's really powerful stuff.
Yes, it is. And you know, where we can do something like that, again, I think, you know, history is something that these days, especially if we're not in lockdown particularly, you can do history, experience history.
A lot of people think, oh, history's in the past, it has no kind of influence on our lives these days, but it does. And
absolutely,
and for you to be able to draw the past into the present, I think that's really powerful for them to actually feel it's still a part of us and it's still here right now, and we're making history, and history has formed who we are right now as well.
Yeah, I actually had a discussion with one of my Key Stage 3 history classes just last week, because we're doing a whole series of 10-minute history debates at the beginning of our lessons, which they requested. So we're just wrestling with some of the big things about history. And the question I put was, history is the most important school subject or home ed subject. And I got them to debate it. We had this whole big discussion over it. And I said to them at one point, I said, why is history important at all? And one of my lads, he's only 12, he said, because the past predicts the future. And I thought, whoa, that is so deep. It is so right. And it is so deep. And he was absolutely right. If we want to know why the world is the way it is now, we need to look at the past. And also, you know, it is amazing how history repeats itself, and I think we can be informed by that. We were talking about, what are we talking about? Something to do with a journey, something coming through Italy. We were talking about Messina. Oh, that's right, because I'm doing Much Ado About Nothing with one of my English classes. And we were talking about Messina. And Messina is where Much Ado About Nothing is set. It's also the hub through which the Black Death came in from China into Europe. It's Italy. Well, we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and COVID-19 has come from China, and it came through Italy. Italy was the hub to which it spread out to the rest of Europe.
Why was Italy the hub? And it's
I don't know.
Twice.
Well, I don't know why the present one. Don't know. You'd have to go and look at the news for that. But in terms of in the 14th century, when the Black Death was breaking out, it was the trade routes. It was the sea routes. Most of the ships that came through, they came through from Alexandria, because the Silk Route kind of brought, by ship, you go from Alexandria and then you sail up the Mediterranean, you go to Messina. It's the first kind of Western European port, and it was a hub where all the ships bringing the luxury stuff from the Silk Road and the Silk Routes, they came to there. And from there, the trade routes then fanned out across France and the rest of Italy, across to Marseille in France, down to Barcelona in Spain. I think it's Barcelona. And so it was a hub, and just, I don't know, for whatever reason, this global pandemic has done the same thing.
Well, I wonder whether it's a stop route then for aeroplanes and that are passing through. Maybe that's where they exchange flights. Maybe that's where.
Yes.
I don't know. Well, I would imagine there's direct flights, but maybe that is still widely used today.
Who knows? I don't really know why it's been the case in the modern period, but I think also, if you want to understand the fear and anxiety that has surrounded the pandemic, and also some of the crazy behavior we've been seeing, especially in the last few days, I think if you look back at the way that people handled the situation at the time of the Black Death, you will actually see the same set of fears, anxieties, and crazy behavior. Although the Black Death, was far more virulent. Of course, it was much more scary than COVID-19, but there's a lot of patterns, an awful lot of similarities. Mm-hmm. History is not irrelevant, because history is, as Barbara Tuchman, the historian, put it, a distant mirror. She wrote this book about the 14th century, which she called a distant mirror. And I think she's right in that the past mirrors the present. It helps us to understand where we came from, and it also, as my student said, it predicts the future. It tells us where we will go if we don't learn from history.
It's really interesting, because I would have said science is the most important subject, just like any teacher would say their subject is the most important. But having you say that quote has just made me realize, actually, even science, it's made on predictions that have been done in the past. It's predictions that you're using evidence from the past to form a prediction for the future.
Yeah.
So even that is, we call it science and scientific evidence, but even that is relying on evidence which has been produced in a period of time in the past, and then utilizing that to make that prediction for the future.
Absolutely.
So that's fascinating, isn't it? And if you look at maths as well, maths has its own history, which is fascinating. But again, we've developed that mathematical process over a serious and period of time. And then that has its own historical roots to it. So it's really fascinating how everything kind of intertwines together.
It does. And I think that's one of the beauties of history, is that, as I discovered in college, how English literature texts intertwine with the history. The history is so entwined with so many other subjects and so many disciplines. I mean, every time we open our mouths and speak English, we are speaking the history of the British Isles and of the rest of the world. The words that we speak come from the Romans, they come from the Vikings, they come from the ancient Celts, they come from the Greeks. We are looking at the consequence of the Norman conquest, bringing French words in.
Yeah.
Every time we open our mouths, we are speaking those words that came into the language as a result of historical events. And so
a lot of things that we consider to be very British is as a result of the empire and people traveling to Britain. Like curry is a big thing in Britain now. And like tea and all and the way that we dress as well. A lot of our clothes now have been inspired by other parts of the world, and it all has significance in historical events that have happened in the past.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been really struck, and many of my history teaching colleagues have been very struck recently with, recent developments and protests against prejudice and things like that. And people have been going back to statues associated with slavery. And all of a sudden, across the Facebook groups that I'm in for my history colleagues, the buzz is all about lessons about the empire, lessons about slavery, lessons about let's address that part of our history. You know, we look at different places like Liverpool, for example, built on slave money. You know, we look around us, the communities we live in, and they are history. You know, you walk out of your door and you are looking at history. The house I live in is a little kind of history time capsule, because it's early 17th century. It's a big rambling farmhouse, and we only just moved in last year, but we got beams everywhere, and we've got these big long beams that run the whole span of the house. They're big long things, and they're ship's timbers.
Wow.
Which makes me want to go, what was the ship? Where have these timbers been?
You need to go and like search all the bits of wood and see whether there's a stamp or something, a date or something on there. I bet there is on one of them.
Yeah, there must be. Yeah, can't be smart. Absolutely. So, you know, I kind of want to go, you know, what was the ship, and who are the guys that were on that ship, and what's it seen? Why did it end up being taken apart? How did it end up in a house?
Yeah,
that kind of thing. Exactly. And I mean, you know, my office has just over there, which you can't see at the moment, but it has a genuine Victorian period fireplace.
Wow.
So you see the little fireplace, and you look at that and you go, okay, I've got central heating radiator just here. But 100 years ago, the folks who lived in this house had to build that fire every day. It's a home educator's dream, really, you know, history.
Brilliant. So I guess that brings us nicely onto those people that are listening at home and they're home educating, or even during the lockdown period, they're at home and they're stuck. What could they be doing with their kids at home that could be inspiring the history side in them? And actually, what are the top tips that you would give?
Yeah, okay, I had to think about this, but I think first of all is to make it organic. And what I mean by that is, you know, we've just been talking about the way that history is interwoven with all sorts of different things. I was thinking about the way that becoming a historian doesn't just mean you are somebody who picks, I don't know, the Napoleonic Wars or the Middle Ages, or wants to research the Second World War or whatever. There are historians of all sorts of different things. So there are food historians, for example, who research the history of food, and they write books about the history of food. I have a book about the history of bread, for example, with lots of historical recipes in it. There are historians of politics and governments and things like that. There are historians of music. So you might love music. One of my daughter's friends is a big thing. Classical music is her thing, but she wants to be a musicologist. So she wants to study music as a subject and then write about its history. I've had a couple of students who are absolute geeks, and they won't blame me for saying this, because they will say yes, they are. They're complete total geeks on military history. Okay, these guys know everything there is to know about every ship, tank, weapon you care to name, about from medieval warfare right up to the present day. So I would say, go and look at the history that interests you. What is your thing? You know, sitting at home during lockdown, okay, we can't get out to a castle or a reenactment event or whatever, but we have the world at our fingertips through our computer screens. So go out there into cyberland and go and find the stuff that interests you. So like for me, it's the Middle Ages. Well, YouTube's one of my favorite sites. I go there and I find loads of wonderful videos about the Middle Ages and how people dressed and how people ate and how they brushed their teeth and why King John was a bad king and the building of castles and all sorts of different things. So use what's at your fingertips and go and study the history you love. I mean, that's one of the things I love doing with Dreaming Spires, is that, and with my own private classes as well, is that I will quite often, I will do as topics things that I love. Yeah. What am I interested in doing? Okay, I'll go and share that with my students. So whatever is your thing, you know, and I think we tend to think of studying history as thinking great big general subjects. Mm-hmm. I'm going to study the Middle Ages. Yeah. Well, what if your thing about the Middle Ages is cookery? So go and cook some medieval food. There are thousands of recipes out there, and I've done this with my students. We have cooked medieval food, and it's been lovely. So be organic about it and link it to other things. You know, if you're going to study the Tudors, cook the food, play the music, make costumes, you know, learn how to bow like a Tudor, watch Tudor movies, do whatever you can, do Tudor art, do Tudor embroidery, paint something, make something.
I guess what you've just described there is whatever thing is your thing. If it's art, if it's sports, if it's science, you can always bring in history into that.
Yeah, absolutely right.
And that doesn't mean that you're any less of a historian. You are still a historian. Because we do a lot of looking at previous scientists that existed. We take a subject, we go back to where it first kind of became known and how it developed. And I always bring in certain people and scientists that people will not generally have heard of, because I find it really fascinating. But that is history.
Yeah.
And then we look at art, we look at the classical masters and we try and replicate their work and we try and use their style. That's history again.
Yes.
And you've kind of made me kind of look at history slightly differently, and I'm hoping people that are, my head's buzzing, ooh, I'm hoping people that are listening to this can kind of see that they are doing history every single day. They just don't realize it. And I think a lot of things we do every single day, we just don't label it as a school subject, and we think, oh, cooking is not maths. It is if you're measuring stuff. And cooking isn't science. It is if you're boiling an egg and you're looking at the chemical reactions. If you're baking, cooking isn't history. It is because you're doing something that's been historically done and you've adapted it to become more modern or whatever. So I think you can link it into whatever subject you're doing.
You can. And
that's really fascinating.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, things like I'm getting my students, some of my English students, we've been looking at writing mystery stories. So we've been studying the mystery genre, and we've been looking at creative writing and how to get inspiration. And so, you know, again, if history is your thing, I've said to them, you want to set it in the Middle Ages, whatever period of time it is you're interested in history, go write your mystery story from that point of view. And we were talking about the fact that sometimes you get archaic language in the language of the time you're talking about. So one of my girls had said, oh yeah, because I read a lot of Enid Blyton, so I've used a lot of 1930s language in my story, which is great, which means she now understands how people spoke in the 1930s. That's history. And I said, you know, don't worry about trying to speak Shakespearean English if you're setting it in the 16th century. Just use some of the vocabulary, some of the spellings maybe, and make it formal, and you get the idea. So I think you can incorporate stuff, but also I think another one of my top tips is to not be afraid to go off on tangents. I think especially at home education, because we are so much more free, especially if we're not doing an exam syllabus, we are free to study the history that we love. And therefore, sometimes you'll find you're going down a particular line of research and something will start going, hello, coming down here, come. And you find that you think, oh, now that's an interesting little sideline there, or a little question. Yeah, okay, let's just go off and do that. And I think it makes it fun.
It does, yeah.
Because you're pursuing your own interests, your own things that are fascinating you at that point, answering a question. So don't be afraid to go off on tangents. Don't be afraid to go off and investigate those little sidelines. And yes, and I think the other thing that I was thinking was, you know, think about how history links to other areas and how you can translate that into other areas. And also I put a whole bunch of phrases down here, coming back to the organic thing: cook it, do it, visit it, watch it, and use it. You know,
if you're like a movie maniac and you just love watching movies, you could just look at historical movies and learn
the history of movies.
Yeah, or the history of movies. But you learn a lot about cultures and the differences between that period of time and our period of time just by watching movies. If the directors have researched it properly and set it properly, you can learn a lot from it. So I've been watching, I was speaking about this in one of the other episodes, that I've been watching I used to watch a lot of Turkish dramas. And there's certain things that they would do and I'd be like, I don't recognize that. Like they would chuck a bucket of water after a car was about to leave. So if someone's visited them, they were leaving, they'd chuck a bucket of water. And I was like, what is that about? So I did some research, and apparently it's you're wishing them good luck.
Gosh.
And I was talking about this with someone else, and in their culture, they're from a different part of the world. In their culture, chucking a bucket of water when someone's leaving is a way of saying, I don't want you back.
Oh
So
my
it's
word!
offensive. So it's like these subtle differences in culture are so fascinating. And you will pick a similar sort of difference when you're looking at different periods of history. Where
Yes.
people will talk differently, or they'll do something differently. You'll be like, oh, where's that come from? And then you can go away and do some research, and there you're learning in the process as well.
Absolutely. And I think, I guess one of the most fun things for me really has been to, in some ways, experience history. So, you know, I spent 4 years at the Tower of London dressed up as a medieval lady, recreating the parts of a medieval royal day. We did medieval Christmas at the Tower. We did all sorts of different things. And then later, when I moved to Wales, I got involved with a 15th century restored farmhouse, which was a wonderful medieval site. And I got involved with the reenactment company that were there. So then I kind of spend my weekends dressed up as a 15th century lady, and I'd give a tour of the house, and I'd watch all my amazing fellow reenactor experts teaching me all sorts of incredible things, from how to cook to how to make ink out of oak galls, and do all sorts of amazing things. You know, and I guess one of the most memorable things I did was I went with them to the site of the Battle of Bosworth, 1485, when Richard III was killed fighting Henry Tudor, and I took part in the full-scale reenactment of the battle. Went on with our company, who were dressed up as, you know, do the soldiers, they do all the combat stuff, and they do it all really authentically. And I went on as a water bearer, so there I was on Bosworth Field with cannons going off and horses charging and guys stabbing each other and all sorts of things in the middle of this battle. And it was only a recreation, and that was scary enough. It gave you enough of an idea of, my word, what must a real battle have been like, you know? And it was something I won't forget in a hurry. But to actually be there and experience it was extraordinary.
When you were doing these reenactments, did it get to a point where, because you were repeating a lot of the stuff, did you get bored by that, or was it always slightly put something slightly different into it, or you were just so passionate about it that you were just like buzzing every single day?
That is a really excellent question. I think with the reenactment stuff, with the 15th century farmhouse and with doing Bosworth and things like that, no, because there was enough variety. 4 years, day in, day out at the Tower of London, I will confess, and people won't believe me, but I did have times when I got unspeakably bored, yes. People just go, how on earth is that even possible? But it is. I think I remember one particular day when, I'm not kidding you, 2 people came up to me and asked me a particular question about the building we were in, and we got into a 10-minute conversation about that. They said goodbye. 2 more people came up to me, asked me exactly the same question, word for word, which took another 10 minutes. And they went away, and another person came up to me and asked me exactly the same question, word for word. I spent half an hour saying the same thing about the same question. And there were some days when you did get the standard 20 questions, and that was about it. And all you were doing was speaking the same thing over and over and over again. And that could be incredibly tedious. But then there were amazing days when you met pop stars and famous actors, and and then you could, there were times where I would be able to pick a medieval story out of the air and have 30 people in front of me, and I'd stand explaining the story or ranting about how Braveheart the movie was inaccurate, or, you know, telling the story of King Edward I or whatever, and that would just be the absolute best.
So you had the ability to kind of take it into your own direction as well.
Yeah, I mean, the way we worked in the Tower, and if you go to the Tower of London at any normal time, my colleagues are still there. They're still doing an amazing job. They also do it at Hampton Court. They still do the same thing. We worked in pairs. We were like TV presenters, so we were trained to do things in the same way. So you get a presenter who would start presenting, greet the people in the room. We'd introduce them to where they were, point out particular features, and then we could take it in any direction we wanted. We could link it to a story or an anecdote, or we could talk about medieval weaponry. We usually had a whole load of artifacts and things on the table in front of us, replicas, which we would use, and we would demonstrate food and dining. We would demonstrate games, and we could choose to tell whatever bit we liked. You only were supposed to talk non-stop for about 5 minutes, and then you had to stop and pass the ball to your partner who would then go off, and part of the skill was anticipating where your partner was going so that you could then come in with a relevant link and take it in your direction. But that was really interesting, because when you did have a big audience, you know, sometimes we'd have 30, sometimes there'd be 100, sometimes it'd be kids, sometimes it was adults, pitching it to the different audiences and just thinking what is going to interest them.
Yeah,
you know,
I guess now that you've explained it, I realize actually there's a lot of variety in that, and you had the ability to kind of pick and choose, and then if you feed off the audience, don't you?
Yes, you do.
You look at what they're interested in, or what kind of questions they're asking, and then you work on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And another aspect of my job, which I haven't mentioned yet, is that I do go as a speaker to groups. So I speak to Women's Institute groups and U3A groups, which kind of large learning organisations for older folks, history societies, all that kind of thing. I go and I have a set of different talks that I go, and so then I'm presenting to a group of adults. And again, you know, I present on a topic, and then we have question times, and sometimes I'll just say to them, just interrupt me as we go if you've got questions, and that takes us in some quite interesting directions. I think, you know, get me in front of an audience and let me spout medieval history for 45 minutes. I am in my elements.
You're like I started off saying, you are with history what I am with science. Give me a platform and just give me a topic title and I will go off on a tangent. Like that's how I can do science. So I think we're very similar but very different topics. I guess the second question I was going to ask you, you didn't ever do your teaching qualification, did you?
No.
And I think that's probably the best way to learn, because I did not have my qualification. I did teaching unqualified for a number of years, and the amount of stuff you pick up naturally and organically, and you kind of adapt, and you get feedback, and it's that organic kind of development of how you learn. So I was teaching A level, and I kind of got feedback from the kids. I would adapt, and I would change resources and do all of that. And then when I did, so if you're ever considering doing teaching, I would say don't. Because then when I did my teaching degree, every teacher that you would work with, and you worked with quite a few different teachers, because you'd go into their class and you'd take over their class, and then they would tell you how to teach. They would tell you how they wanted to do it based on their style. And it's not natural for you to try and teach in someone else's style.
No. Then
you'd obviously kind of stutter, and you'd be like, oh, and you feel uncomfortable, and you're in a position where you've got lots of new kids and new faces, and it's very difficult. So when I left teaching, it took me a long time to unpick and undo everything that I'd been taught in those kind of those 5-6 years that I was teaching, because it's not how we teach as to home editors, and it's not how we teach if we're teaching from a place of passion. Because when you're teaching, when you're passionate about something, you want to go off on a tangent and draw things in. Because if there's a question being asked and it takes you off course, that's brilliant, because it shows that they're listening.
Yes.
So you want to go off and you want to draw people in. So yeah, I think it's really fascinating that you've come from that background of no teaching qualification, and you've developed the practice that I've always wanted to develop. And I felt like going into teaching actually hindered that, and had to unpick that to then kind of come back to it again. So if anyone's listening and is thinking about becoming a teacher, by all means teach. Just you don't have to follow the teaching qualification route.
Yeah, that's true. I think two things to say on that. One is that if you're thinking of teaching, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to go into a state school or even a private school and teach in a classroom. But there is a massive variety of different environments and different ways of teaching that you can be involved in. I mean, you know, I've been involved in 3 quite large online teaching organizations, 2 of which I'm still with. And that was, you know, I am qualified in the sense that I have degrees in both my subjects. So I'm qualified to teach privately. I'm just not qualified to do the thing I don't want to do, which is go and teach in a state school classroom. I don't want to do that.
All you actually need is the passion and the knowledge. If you've got those, you're a teacher.
I think, yeah. I think it also involves a large amount of actually being able to communicate in a way that you can take information, you can break it down so that people can understand it, and you can help to inspire people to love it. You know, I think there is that. But I will also say that on an ongoing basis, I have been training myself. I learn from my colleagues. I do a lot of, you know, reading what my colleagues are saying. I'm in groups for the subjects that I teach. I've put several years worth of students through English and history, GCSEs and A levels successfully, I'm glad to say. But only because I've gone and learned from my colleagues. I go on CPD, continuing professional development training days and webinars. I've got a whole program of stuff set up for this summer, which I'm going to be learning some more stuff about teaching students with special needs, some more training for history teaching, various different things I'm going to be doing to learn how to do my job better. Do some more stuff about online, and also widening out how I can get my Key Stage 3 kids writing for authentic audiences, and doing all sorts of things. So, you know, and I've done a lot of reading mark schemes, reading examiners' reports, reading books about, you know, how to do things, looking at videos and things that teachers have put out. I do a lot of learning and training along the way. I don't have the bit of paper, but I have 20 years experience and the willingness to keep learning. And I think you have to, you know.
I think as adults, we have to continue learning. And I think when you're not being forced to go and do CPD, when you're not being forced to do something, you seek it out because you want to do it. And I think that's very powerful. The kids, even with kids, if kids aren't ready to learn, then you could be giving them so much information and so much teaching and learning that it's not going to go in. You have to be willing to do it. And I think that's the most important thing. If you're willing to learn and you're willing to adapt, that's far, far greater a resource and an asset that you've got than a piece of paper. I think there's loads of people that I've met that are amazing at what they do. And they don't have a paper or a degree to show for it, but they've got the wealth of experience and the knowledge and the skills that they've acquired over time. And that's something far more powerful that you can get from a degree where you're given the information and then you're told to, you're examined on that information. So it's very different from how some people perceive society. They think you need to have that piece of paper to show that you've gotten, you can do something. But I think the experience that you've accumulated, the skills that you've developed, and the passion and the desire to learn more has a much greater meaning in today's society, because we're constantly changing. So everything goes out of date very quickly, and if you don't change with the times, you get left behind. So having a degree from 10 years ago makes no sense to kind of point to that when you're going into a new job. You're going to have to retrain because things have moved on. So anything that you do nowadays, you have to relearn, and the skills that you develop are amazing because you can apply it to whatever. So the skills that you developed in English at uni, you applied it to history. Yes, applied it to lots of different areas. The skills I learned in learning physics, I can now apply it to chemistry, even though I'm not a chemistry specialist. I stopped chemistry at GCSE, but I'm apparently qualified to teach it. I'll teach chemistry, but I won't go as far as biology. That's where I stop. But it's fascinating how teachers come from a variety of different backgrounds, and great teachers are the ones that have the passion and have the desire to keep continuing to learn and to develop and to do it continually. And I think your journey is amazing, and I think it's a testament that you don't need a qualification, because what you've produced, like I've seen the content that you are advertising, and I'm like, oh my god, I would have loved this as a kid. Like I want to take part in that. I get so inspired. Like everything I run, I make sure it's something that me as a kid would have loved doing. And I think I can see that in your work. Like you draw in like the food. I've read some of the stuff that you've said where they go away and they work on projects and they watch documentaries and all of this. And I think, wow, that's really inspirational and amazing. So I think the wealth of knowledge you've got is amazing. And because you're very passionate, you're able to adapt. You can take any period of history and kind of go with it, because it's just adapting. While sometimes when you're coming from a place where you've taught a particular thing in a school for a period of time, it becomes really daunting when you're kind of given something else to do. You're like, I don't know what to do.
It's the same skills. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly for me with history, you know, you could ask me to teach any period in history, and I would apply the same principles for teaching history across those different periods. You know, so I mean, I've taught the Second World War, and over the summer I'm going to be teaching a short course for Dreaming Spires on the Second World War itself. But you know, I can be asked to go and mark an A-level history essay on Roman Britain, you know. But I think if you teach history long enough, and I think maybe a lot of my colleagues will say this as well, I don't know, but certainly for me, what I've been careful to do over the past 20 years is develop a thorough working knowledge of more or less the last 2,000 years. So I know quite a lot, if you know, about most periods during that time.
That's at a rate of 100 years per year that you've been doing.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I think one of the things I did, particularly in my early stages of teaching, particularly Key Stage 3, was I'd set myself stuff that I'd never taught before, or periods that I didn't know much about, and I'd take on periods I didn't know much about, so that through the researching, planning, teaching and delivery of that unit, I would then learn that period, you know.
Exactly the same process I do with the science. Like, I get some parents that are so fascinated, they're like, you know so much, and I'm like, no. So very little.
Yeah.
Pick a topic that I think I'm going to find intriguing, and then I spend 10 or 11, 12 hours researching it so I can develop a workshop series out of it. I know very little at any point in time, because the knowledge comes and then it'll kind of drift away because I'll move on to something else. But when I come back to it a few years later, I can kind of re-trigger it quite quickly. But I do the exact same process where I'll pick a topic where I know nothing about. And then I'll go away and I'll do the research, and I'll realize stuff I learned at school actually wasn't completely correct, or it wasn't in as much detail. So I've just finished, I think it was last week, we did Animal Kingdom.
Right.
And we looked at the different classifications of animals. This is biology, I don't know biology. So we looked at mammals and amphibians and reptiles and all the rest. Now, when I was at school, the last time I learned about that must have been primary school, maybe year 6, maybe year 7, year 8, maybe. And I was told that mammals have live young, like they give birth to young.
Yeah, that's what I was taught.
Yeah, that's not true.
Really?
So I made the mistake of not going away and researching that, because I thought I knew that. So I taught that in my class, and then one of the parents messaged and she goes, I've just been having a conversation with my husband, and he's pretty sure that there's mammals that lay eggs, and he said platypuses are one of them.
Goodness.
Because he's from Australia. So then I went and I was like, oh, that's like, let me just do some research. I did some research, and actually there's 3 different ways that mammals have babies. And one of them through laying eggs, one of them they give birth, and then there's another one, which is a kangaroo, where it kind of gives birth to something, but it's not a fully formed thing, and then it kind of grows in its pouch. So I was like, wow. So what I learned was incorrect, and I hadn't gone back and checked it, thinking I had that knowledge and relying on school. So a lot of the stuff that you learn, you realize is actually not completely truly correct. They just simplified it, or they've missed out bits. And I think you find out in history that happens a lot,
all the time,
especially when you read horrible histories and you're learning about the same period at school, and you're like, none of that was mentioned.
Horrible histories is one of my faves. I absolutely love them. I think they're amazing. I think horrible histories is one of the best things that ever happened to history teachers, because it just has inspired so many kids to love history, and it just makes our job so much easier. And you know, I have used horrible history stuff where I can in my courses. I think they're amazing. So, you know, well done to them. But history, is constantly rewriting itself, and we are finding so much out all the time. So, you know, even some of the major stories of history we now have to look at in a different way, because we realize that actually what you learned, like what I learned many years ago when I was at school, They didn't know half of what they know now about different things. Middle Ages. One of the things I have to do when I go and speak to older folks about medieval history is I have to debunk some of the well-known myths that they grew up with. Things like medieval people didn't have any table manners and threw their food around, which is not true. That they were all short, which is not true. That castles are always cold, which is not true. You know, all sorts of different things, because we now know an awful lot more about those things that we didn't know back then.
Constant relearning,
right, yeah.
to refresh your knowledge again.
Yep.
But I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned over the years, is that I can't rely on knowledge that I thought I had at school. And last week was a great kind of reminder of that again, where I thought I knew that bit. Clearly I didn't. But it's amazing how very little we actually know. Even though we've been in the education system for such a long time. And I think when I left uni, I realized actually I didn't know anything. When you come to teach and the kids are asking all these questions again,
yes,
I have no idea.
Yeah, and when they come out and go, did you know blah 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 blah, you know, and you go, oh no, I didn't know that. Oh, that's really interesting. And my kids teach me all the time. You know, I learn stuff from my kids all the time.
I guess from history, it's just it's facts that you're learning, which is a lot to take in at any one point anyway. But from a science perspective, it's like, how does it work? Why? And then if you don't know the answer to that, it's like you don't have a workshop. So you have to do a lot of research to kind of find why, and then you do the research and you realize actually there's more whys, so that you do more research, and it's like this never ending. And I guess you can find that with history. When you answer one question, you find actually it opens up a couple of other doors, and you're like, okay, well, why did that happen there?
That's true. I think there's two sides to history. There is the facts and the information. There's also what you do with that information, and the fact that surrounding history is what we call historiography, which is what historians write and think about the history that's happened. And I spend a lot of time with my students talking about how people interpret history, you know, and how we can pick up a piece of parchment or an artifact from the 14th century and talk about that object, but we're talking about it from the point of view of what we know, what we understand through the filters of our own worldviews. And then we can look at the different debates. I mean, for example, one of the things I come to all the time is Richard III. Did he order the death of the princes in the Tower? Well, if you read the Richard III Society, they will give you lots and lots of really amazing reasons why he was totally innocent. And then you'll get other people who read the traditional side of things, and they'll say, oh, he absolutely was totally guilty. It's a mystery we can't solve. Therefore, we'll be debating it. People will interpret it all the time. So, you know, half of history is actually how people view it, and the way that people view historical events and people over time changes over time, depending on where you are. For example, and I'll make this really quick, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the British Empire was a fantastic thing. And many people thought, yeah, and this is not my view. Let me just make this very clear. This is not my view. But many people in the British Empire at that time would have thought it was perfectly right to enslave people, to take over other countries and draw their resources from that country, for example. You take that forward 150 years, we are now becoming more and more ashamed of the British Empire, maybe because we're looking at it in the cold light of day and saying, we have a lot to say sorry for. Yeah. You know, the British Empire was not actually the big glorious thing it was made out to be. People are now tearing down statues of people to do with slavery. People are now apologizing for acts that were to do with all that, and quite rightly so. You know what I mean? But that means that the way that people have seen that period of time we call the British Empire has radically changed. We have a totally different view on it, a different interpretation, and we will learn and teach about it from a completely different worldview, because now we're much more willing to say, actually, we have no right to go and walk into somebody else's country. We have no right to go and enslave people. That was a horrific thing to do. We have no right to judge people by the color of their skin or where they come from or the language they speak or the culture or their religion. We're all human beings, we're all precious, and we all deserve a place here. You know what I mean? But it hasn't always been the case for people to believe that.
The more that we've gone through this interview, the more that I've realized there's a big, like, how similar history is to science. Because even science is, you've got the facts, like you've got with history, but then a lot of it is interpretation of those facts.
Yeah.
And how you use the evidence to support your claim. Like I was just teaching the Big Bang Theory earlier today, and how I mentioned how for a long period of time everyone thought that the universe was always steady, and it was always the way it was, and it was always going to remain the same way. And now we've got new evidence which suggests that there's actually a big explosion, and it's still expanding. And who knows, in 100 years time we might actually have a completely different theory based on new evidence. And then our perception of it completely changes. So even science is history as well, but
yes,
much further away, like further. It's so fascinating,
isn't it just?
It made me really think about how I perceive history. And I think from because I've only learned it at school. I say that even though I've been doing historical stuff for science, and I think my kind of perception of it has been, yeah, I've done that. I don't do history anymore. But the more I kind of have heard you talk about it, I'm like, actually, I'm doing history every single day.
You are, indeed.
When I'm teaching science, that is history.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
When I'm teaching algebra and maths, that goes back to the Babylonian times.
Yeah, absolutely right.
So it's fascinating how much of what we do is not really, it's not really modern society that has birthed all of this. It's all the historical stuff and all the work that people have put in the past.
Yes.
That has meant that we can do what we do now and learn what we do learn now and have the rights that we have now, and that's fascinating.
Indeed, yeah, it is.
You've almost made me think that history is the most important subject. That's scary.
I confess to my students, and most people will probably be horrified to say this, I don't necessarily think it is the most important school subject to learn.
What do you think is?
I think I find that a really hard question to answer. I think there's probably a group of top subjects that it is absolutely vital that we learn. History is one of them.
Okay, maybe we should say language is the most important, so English. Or a language, because without that you can't communicate anything.
Well, that's very true. But then, you know, maths describes how the universe works.
And art you can use without learning a language.
Exactly, that's right. I don't think it's that easy to actually say this subject is the most important or that subject. I think where we get into danger is where we relegate subjects to not being important.
Yeah.
But don't get me started there.
We can have a whole other podcast on that.
Yeah, indeed.
We should get lots of experts in different subjects and have a debate on this.
Oh, that'd be fantastic. Great idea.
Right, so we're going to move on. I know we've run over slightly, so we're going to have one question because I want you to answer a question before we go.
Okay.
So what subject would you want? Science, tech, engineering, arts, or maths? Arts or engineering might require you to cut something, so you might want to stick with a discussion question.
Gosh, I want to know why history isn't in that list.
I need to put history in there.
Yeah, you need to put some history in there. I don't know. Science, let's go science.
Let's go for science. Okay, we probably had a lot of these questions before, but it's always nice to hear someone else's interpretation. Okay, so I've picked one question out from there. Let's open it out. And it says, will time travel ever be possible?
Oh, I hope so. I so hope so. I think it depends on whether
they relevant to you because you'd love to go back in time.
I know. I was just thinking, what a gift of a question. I so hope so. I mean, it's one of those questions that I discuss so often with my students. What would it be like to have a TARDIS and actually go back to that issue, that person, to change that bit, to, you know, to go and actually...
Though, if you went back and changed it, it would change everything.
Well, this is the truth. This is true. We have debated at length in many of my classes what would happen if we were in that trench with the soldier who's facing the very young Corporal Hitler and points a gun at him, sees the terror in his face, lets him live and walk off around the corner of the trench in the First World War, which did happen apparently. What if you were in that trench? I've posed the question, would you tell the soldier to shoot?
But that would completely change everything.
Oh, I know. And the ethics, the debate that came out, it was brilliant. I think the actual question you asked, which was, would time travel ever become possible? That, I think, depends on our increasing understanding of the nature of physics and the way the universe is put together. And, we are learning more and more about what the universe is like. If I wasn't so utterly dreadful at maths and physics, I might have studied astronomy and things like that, because I love astronomy. I love all things to do that. My husband's into, what's it called? Is it spiral maths? I can't remember it. Toroids and all that kind of thing. But patterns and the golden section and Fibonacci numbers and all that kind of stuff, I find utterly fascinating. And I think also what people are learning about how fast the universe really is expanding. You look up at the stars, you're looking at history. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Because you're not looking at the star as it was now, you're looking at it as it was several centuries ago, or thousands of years ago, or millions of years ago, depending on how long it's taken that light to travel to your eyeball.
Even the sun, if it exploded, we wouldn't know until 8.5 minutes later.
Well, there you go.
It's that long for the light to reach us.
There you go. So every time we look up at the sky at night, we are looking back in time.
Yeah.
That is history. It's extraordinary. But I think it would take a lot more understanding of the laws of physics and how far you could actually warp the space-time continuum to actually get it to open up enough for you to go through it. And I would love to see if somebody was eventually able to answer that question. Can the fabric of space-time be manipulated in such a way that you can travel in time? I would love to see that happen. And I would be queuing up.
Where would you go?
Where would I go? I'll tell you where I would go. For the last 20 years, I've been researching a lady called Lady Isabella de Vesci. That was her married name. Her maiden name was de Beaumont. And she was a very big character in the reigns of Edward I, Edward II, and Edward III. That's the end of the 13th century into the mid-14th. I was the first person ever to do any research on her, and I kind of discovered her. Other people have been slowly starting to understand some stuff about her, but I have 20 years worth of reconstructing her life, her history, the manners she held, the places she went, who her friends were, her life with the royal courts, all sorts of different stuff. And she will be the subject of my PhD one day. And if I had a TARDIS and I could go back in time, I would go to some of the places and times that I have pinpointed her, and I said, yes, I know that on this day, on that time, she was in that place. And I'd go to one of those and I would go and meet her.
But what if your conversation altered everything that happened after?
This is, that's something.
Even if you just asked her a question, like when we speak to someone, I always find this really fascinating discussion with people, that we often think that our thoughts and our kind of decisions are our own. Nothing is ever our own, because whenever someone says a sentence to you, they're planting a seed in your head.
Yeah.
And it changes the way that you think about something or perceive something, or the way that, this is why it's really important to be around people that are positive and pushing you and aren't pulling you back, because over time you become that negative person if you're around negative people.
True, yeah.
So I think even if you went back and you just wanted to have a conversation, or you had one or two questions to ask her, right? That would get her thinking about why are you asking that question? It would change maybe one of her decisions that she's made, or where she ended up going that day, or something, because you would be on her mind then and not what she was originally thinking about. And imagine the impact just that one little sentence would have on the rest of history, and we don't know what that impact would be. Would you?
And that's true. That is absolutely true. But to bring it forward, isn't that what we as educators do every day of our lives?
Yeah.
Where we talk to a child or a young person whose confidence is broken for whatever reason, and we say something positive to them, or we guide them in something that means they've got their first victory, their first place where they can actually lift their head up and said, I did that, I can do that.
Yeah.
You know, just by what we say. And isn't that changing the world?
It is. And I think this is why it's really heartbreaking when you hear about lots of kids being going through the system and ending up completely being disenfranchised and because of the fact that there has been stuff said and they've just completely stopped learning, essentially.
Yes.
And they're leaving without being able to read or write, or without basic skills. And I think you think the rest of their life is going to be formed on those early years that they've had in the education system. And I think as tutors, because we're out of that system, we're able to have that impact and make those changes and try and reverse that, which is a lot harder. I think it'd be easier if we had it right the first time round.
Yes.
But it is what it is. And I think if we were to change the system as it is, it would have to completely be changed upside down to make the changes that we need to make. But that's not in our power. So we can only do what's in our power. But as parents, as educators, as teachers, we have the power to change the future. And
we do.
Powerful.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right.
I think this is a lovely place to end as well now. It's been amazing to have you. I've really loved this conversation.
Thank you. It's been a delight. I've really enjoyed it.
How can people get in touch with you? Is there a website that they can go on to contact you?
On Facebook, I have my own tutoring page, Yvonne Mason English and History Tutor. I don't have a website just yet.
Fine, you can direct them to your Facebook. So if you give me that link, I'll put it down in the description so people can go there. So what can they find when they go on the Facebook page?
What they'll find is information. If they go to the About section, they'll get a very, very shortened version of what we've been talking about today. So they'll get a bit of about my history. They'll be able to see what other of my past students and clients have written about me. They'll see my qualifications. They'll see my prices and what I offer. But also I try to keep my page a bit lively as well. So I've been doing some live talks recently while we've been on lockdown. So there's some recordings there. If they look on the live section or the video section, I've got 3 talks up there at the moment of various things to do with medieval history. They can go and listen to those. But also sometimes I'll share a bit of what my life as a tutor is like, or I'll put some advice up there if you're doing an exam or whatever. So I try to keep things lively on the page as well, so people can interact with me that way. And also, you know, you can get involved in my courses through Dreaming Spires Home Learning. They've got a website, and I guess really I should get a website of my own together for people who aren't on Facebook. Yeah. But I suppose
Facebook works because most people have Facebook anyway. So that's Yvonne Mason Tutor.
Yvonne Mason English and History Tutor.
English and History Tutor.
Yeah.
I will put that in the description so you can find all the information and reach out if you want to join one of the courses. I would join if I was a kid. So I think you really need to have a look at those courses because they look absolutely amazing.
Well, you could come and do one of my 6-week summer school for adults medieval history course I'm teaching over the summer. I'm going to do an adult one starting in a week or so. Yeah, so you can come and join in that.
I think I'm going to be in. I just need to check my diary. If I'm available, I'm in. I thought you just did kids, but if you're
no, I teach adults whenever I can as well.
Brilliant. I think I'm going to be in for that.
You'll be most welcome.
So thank you for joining us today. It's been absolutely amazing. So this has been a slightly longer show, but an amazing show with lots of information. So if you've made it up to the end, brilliant. And we'll have all the information in the description, and let us know what you think. Like, comment, and share, and have fun, guys. And we'll see you next week. Bye.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.